So in our weekly tech feature, we look at the trending and tech-related issues that affects you as the consumer. This week we look at coded bias, and it's a scary technological documentary that seeks to uncover racial and sexist bias in face recognition software and other artificial intelligence systems. And it's a documentary that I didn't see it yet, but I saw something similar where this artificial intelligence was used in this particular software in order to racially profile people in America and to also preempt whether they would be committing a crime and what kind of crime they would commit. And that was very controversial because many times they actually got the wrong person. But we have a clip of the trailer to this documentary. Let's take a quick listen.
During my first semester at MIT, I got computer vision software that was supposed to track my face. It didn't work until I put on this white mask. I'm thinking, all right, what's going on here? Is it the lighting conditions? Is it the angle at which I'm looking at the camera? Or is there something more? That's when I started looking into issues of bias that can creep into technology.
Our ideas about technology that we think are normal are actually ideas that come from a very small and homogeneous group of people.
Vast amounts of data at incredible speeds.
Everybody has unconscious biases, and people embed their own biases into technology.
This kid got stopped as a result of facial recognition misidentification, and then used that as justification to search you. This is an innocent child.
Racism is becoming mechanized.
Systemic issues are only going to be hardwired into new technologies.
Scary stuff. That is the documentary, the clip that we played there, and a coded bias coding, something that we don't really pay much attention to because we're so busy with our own worlds, and when we hear the word coding, some of us we kind of freak out, but we don't understand how it can impact and discriminate against us if abused. Nazareen Ebrahim is the CEO of Socially Acceptable, joins me on the line and gives us her thoughts on the docudrama. Nazareen, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. Just your thoughts on these issues around bias coding.
Thanks, Jeremy. Nice to talk to you on this edition. I think watching coded bias was very interesting for me as a tech communicator from my perspective working in the tech field, particularly because it did a much more effective job of articulating how algorithms have a certain sense towards human beings and how we are classified, profiled, as well as prejudiced by these algorithms of huge tech corporations. I think it did a much better job than The Social Dilemma did on Netflix, which we talked about recently on the show as well. Mm-hmm. The Social Dilemma was good in talking about how you have a certain addiction to social media channels and how that addiction is portrayed through the functionality of the site. But algorithms in and of themselves have a certain role to play. That role is to get you to do something or to predict something. And this particular documentary, Coded Bias, was interesting for me because here is a black woman, Joy Buolamwini, who is an MIT researcher. And at the Media Lab, she decided to take a look at different recognition software. Because of her work, and works also a research paper by Timnit Gebru, who's a Microsoft senior researcher, they were able to get Amazon to stop using their facial recognition technology or selling it to police earlier this year in the U.S., as well as having a congressional hearing. Now, these movements, Jeremy, in terms of that particular part of the world, are important for us as a basemark or a kind of landmark movement in terms of how digital citizens are able to start understanding once we use these technologies, we are part of the system, we are part of the product, but how do they help us to move humanity along? Yeah. Do they help to move or hinder?
Yeah, and I think on that point, Nazareen, in terms of the coding community, people who are populating algorithms and getting AI sorted for various programs, etc., etc. It also then raises the issue of how do we then ensure that coders act ethically, that software doesn't impact on our constitutional rights and our human rights, because in the wrong hands, it can have devastating effects. So as a community, what should happen to ensure that we have enough measures to counteract that, or at least limit the kind of discrimination and dangers that can come out of bias?
Thank you for asking this question. It's an important one which has to be asked all the time. As citizens of the country, as people of the world, we also have what is called a digital identity. So I would say, and this is the work that we're doing at Socially Acceptable as a social tech enterprise, we are working towards responsible digital citizenry. That simply means that all the code that is written to output something, whether it's used by banks, healthcare to store your details for you to get treatment, if you're going to a bank to apply for a loan, and if an algorithm is making a decision based on where you live and the prediction that you may or may not be able to pay and the fact that you have a certain surname, that's problematic in and of itself. So where does that decision-making come from? It comes from data. Yeah. And the data sets that are fed to these models need to be interrogated, which is why AI ethics is such an incredible component of the conversation. It has to be in a part of the conversations held around when these systems are talked about. How do we know that they're serving everyone for good?
I would also imagine that one of the ways forward would be, Nazareen, just as a layperson, I understand very little about technology, but I do understand the benefits of AI in my life on a daily basis. The way forward, would you say that it's now time to seriously engage regulators, government, social movements in terms of getting a collective conversation together to ensure that AI ethics are created comprehensively and implemented and enforced at certain points?
That's it. You've hit the nail on the head here. Regulation, and this is also one of the key debate points in the coded bias, is regulation catching up quickly enough at the rate of innovation, at the pace of innovation? Why is innovation so quick to evolve? It's because of the sheer computing power that we have. But if we are also able to have a responsibility with the private sector who produce these types of technologies, alongside the governments who have the power of regulatory control, we are able to have a dual conversation. In the middle of that dual conversation are the people who can make the change, which is us, the citizens. And as an AI ethics officer myself, it is our job to be able to, and have more of us in the community as AI ethics officers, to be able to push this conversation and pursue the change. Nazareen
Ebrahim is the CEO at Social Acceptable, and we're talking about the documentary Coded Bias. When AI and technology gets into the wrong hands, then it can be very dangerous, and we need to be aware.